Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. I hope you're all well wherever you are and whatever you're up to. I'm Lauren, and in my video this week I'm going to be chatting to you about block fusing woolen fabrics in the context of dressmaking and making your own coat at home. And I think that sewing and making a coat is possibly one of the most satisfying things that you can ever make, closely followed by jeans. They're also very satisfying. And the reason that I just love making coats and jackets so much is that you just get so much wear out of them. Sure, they take longer to make, but you can really get your teeth into it, enjoy the process. You can plan that your coat will go with loads of things in your wardrobe. You can wear it every day, and you can pull it out winter after winter, and just get so much use out of it. So over the past couple of years, I've taught quite a lot of sewing retreats that are focused on coat and jacket making with my friend Layla, and a question that comes up a lot is whether to block fuse with interfacing the whole of the outer fabric for the garment before you actually start constructing it. Now, the answer to that question, as with a lot of things in dressmaking, is not like a simple, straightforward yes, do it, or no, do it. A lot of things in this, sewing's an art, isn't it? So everything's always open to interpretation and personal preferences. But hopefully in this video, I'm going to just explain to you the types of things that you might want to consider and just give you a bit of a better understanding about what it's all about, really. So just to be really upfront from the beginning, all of the tips and suggestions that I'm going to suggest are based on my own personal experiences. I've made 7 coats and jackets over the last 5 years, and over the last 2 years, I was trying to count them up. I think I've taught about 7 sewing retreats where people have been making coats and jackets, and there's always 8 people in those retreats. So I've seen quite a lot of coats come together. So hopefully I've got a good understanding of what works when it comes to doing this, in terms of just what I've seen in the past and experienced myself as well. So first of all, I want to cover what does actually all of this mean. There's quite a few terms that you may find get used a little bit interchangeably, so I just want to try to explain them so that you've just got a better understanding of what it means. Block fusing, spot fusing, steam basting, all of these things. So block fusing is basically a term that gets used in the garment manufacturing industry where certain parts of a garment, so for example, if it's got facings around the neck or the armhole, or it's got a cuff or a collar or a button placket, sections of the garment that need interfacing. Basically, before those pattern pieces are cut out or those sections are cut out, the interfacing is bonded onto the fabric first of all, and then they're cut out. So this can be a great time saver because it means that you're not having to cut out the fabric and then the interfacing and then bond it together, because it's a bit more fiddly to attach the interfacing once the fabric is actually cut out. And it's also good in fabrics that are quite slippy or move around a lot. So viscose, for example, classic example of that is that viscose just slips around a lot. So if you put your interfacing onto the viscose fabric before you cut those sections of the garment out, then it just makes it a little bit more accurate and it stops the fabric from distorting before you actually put the interfacing on. Block fusing, it can also apply to when you fuse the whole of the main fabric before you actually cut your pieces out in the context of making a coat. So say you're making a coat out of a woolen fabric, you would put interfacing onto the whole of that fabric before you cut any pattern pieces out, and then once you've cut the pattern pieces out, you then go back and make sure that the interfacing is really bonded on. Now, the reason that you might want to do something like that is depending on the type of fabric, it might just give the fabric some more stability and some more structure. So if the fabric was quite a loose weave, or if it had a bit of give or a bit of stretch in it and you didn't necessarily want that, so boiled wool is quite a common one, it normally has quite a bit of give in it too, or if the fabric was fraying a lot, or it can also help to hold the design lines of a garment. So if the coat that you're making is quite structured, or it's got quite a strong A-line shape, for example, and the fabric that you're using is just a little bit lighter weight, if you put interfacing on the whole of the fabric, it can just help to hold those style lines of the garment in a much better place. So another term that you might hear in the context of all of this is spot fusing, and it again can have a few different meanings depending on the context that it's used. So it might be that you are spot fusing like a small section of a garment. So for example, say there's a patch pocket on a garment, then you might want to put a little sort of spot of like a little square section, say, of interfacing at the top edge of the pocket where it's stitched onto the fabric, just to support the fabric and the stitching at that place of the pocket, and it just makes the pocket more robust and gives it more stability. Or spot fusing can also mean like a stage in the process to block fusing a whole area of fabric. So as I was saying before, if you're deciding to block fuse the whole of your entire fabric for a garment that you're making, you wouldn't necessarily like permanently bond that whole interfacing onto the fabric before you cut it out, because you get a lot of wastage, right? When you cut your pattern pieces out, there's loads of bits of fabric that you don't actually use. You don't really want to spend time like properly fusing the interfacing on everywhere. You just do it in certain spots. So it's just sort of temporarily held in place until you cut your pieces out, and then you permanently bond them. Steam basting is another term that you might come across, and in the context of block fusing like a whole entire piece of fabric, steam basting is really the same thing as spot fusing, really. So it's like using the steam from the iron to baste the interfacing. So baste is like a temporary thing, just a stage in a process to doing something permanently, that you would steam baste the interfacing on in sections, and then, as I said, once you've cut your actual pattern pieces out for your garment, then you would like go and permanently adhere the interfacing on. You have to go over all the pieces that you've cut out afterwards. So in the context of making a coat out of woolen fabric, remember, wool is a natural fibre. It will sort of mould to your body and kind of change shape and kind of wear in as you sort of, you wear and you use the garment. So block fusing the whole entire outer fabric can help to prevent the elbows getting saggy over time or getting a saggy bottom. So where the fabric just sort of stretches and kind of changes shape over that part of the garment. I think it's also quicker to do that rather than cut out separate individual interfacing pieces and then have to put them all onto the fabric, because when you block fuse your whole entire main outer fabric, you don't then need to put the interfacing on the specific sections that the pattern might tell you to. So quite often coat patterns will tell you to put a section across the back shoulders, the upper back, because that's a common place that coats can stretch out, because there's obviously gravity and like that part of the coat gets a lot of stretch and movement, because you're like moving, if you're moving your arms around as you're wearing the coat. Quite often some sections of the front will get interfaced too. If it's got a facing, obviously that gets interfaced. But yeah, when you block fuse the whole entire fabric, you're not then going to add additional interfacing on top of that. It's like that stage of the process is kind of already done. Then, as I was saying before, if your woolen fabric is kind of on the lighter side in terms of weight and kind of thickness, then adding the interfacing onto the whole of the fabric before you make the coat can just give it a lot more stability and structure, and I think just generally give the coat much more longevity. So you've got your woolen fabric to make your coat and you're deciding whether you should actually block fuse it or not. Should you do it? Should you not? Now, I would say, generally speaking, it's probably better to do it, in my experience. I've only not done it twice. The first time was the very first time that I made a coat, and I actually really regret it. The fabric was a bit more of a looser weave, and yeah, I just feel like the coat has now gone quite kind of limp and sort of just kind of saggy, and just doesn't have the same sort of like crispness and structure to it that you would expect from a coat, and that is because I didn't interface the whole of the outer fabric. Then the other time that I didn't do it was when I made my Grainline Studios Cascade duffel coat, which if you've been watching my YouTube channel for a while, you might remember that. I made that last year, and the fabric that I used to make that was really, really thick. It was actually kind of like 2 layers of fabric that were sort of bonded or kind of sewn together, so it was really quite a thick, chunky fabric, and if I had interfaced the whole thing, I think it would have just been too much. The machine already was like really working hard to sew all of the seams. I did still put the interfacing on in the specified sections that were in the pattern for that, so in the areas where it told you to put interfacing on, I just didn't put it all over the whole coat. But if it's kind of anything less weighty than that, I would suggest it is probably better just to interface it, for the reasons that I've said before. It'll just make the coat last a lot longer, it just gives it much more structure and shape, and yeah, I just think that it will make the coat look a lot better. Of course, if you were making an unlined coat that was maybe more of a relaxed casual style, or that it was unlined, then you wouldn't be interfacing the whole of the garment in that context, because you'd actually see the interfacing. So it needs the garment that you're making needs to be lined really, so that you don't see the interfacing once the whole thing's constructed. So now I want to chat about how do you actually block fuse and spot fuse your interfacing onto your fabric. Now, it is really likely that the interfacing that you get will not be as wide as the fabric that you've got. So fabric that you will use to make coats, woolen fabric, is typically going to be wide, so it's going to be anywhere between 140 and maybe like 150 centimetres, somewhere in that region. And the woven interfacing that you get typically comes on rolls that are only 90 centimetres wide, so it means that you're going to kind of have 2 drops of interfacing for the length of your fabric, and then there'll obviously be a bit of extra interfacing that doesn't come onto the fabric. So just bear that in mind. It depends how wide the fabric is. Like, you could use the extra bit of interfacing that hangs off the edge. You could use that to actually fuse it on as well. Or it may just mean that you actually have to have 2 whole complete drops. So you basically need double the amount of interfacing that you have of your fabric. So that's just something to kind of bear in mind. Now, there's 2 ways that you could do it. I've done it in both ways. You can either do it on the ironing board, or you can do it on a flatter surface, like, if you've got like a big dining room table or whatever, kitchen worktop, or I have actually done it on the floor before, which I wouldn't recommend because you're just crawling about in your knees and it's like a little bit annoying. But yeah, you can either do it on an ironing board or like a bigger surface. If you're not doing it on the ironing board, you need something underneath the fabric, obviously, to protect the surface that you're on. So in the shop we have it's called the Prim ironing blanket, and it's basically like a little sort of portable blanket that you can get that reflects the heat, so it protects the surface that you're on. So you would have to use something like that. You can get various sort of more portable ironing mats and things. You would have to have something like that if you weren't doing it on the ironing board. But more recently I've just been doing it on the ironing board and actually found that it's totally fine. So what I would suggest that you do is lay your main fabric out onto the ironing board with the wrong side of the fabric facing towards you, and then the gluey side of the interfacing goes face down onto that, and you want to line up the edge of your interfacing to the selvage edge of your fabric. Just make sure that it's really nice and smooth and flat. Now, you won't get the whole of your fabric onto the ironing board either, but you should get the width of the interfacing on. So you just sort of set up like a little area, make sure everything's smooth, and then when you come to actually then spot fuse or steam base the interfacing on, I would say for like the area of an ironing board, maybe like 3 or 4 approximately sort of areas of your iron, so you're not ironing the whole of the interfacing on over the whole of the surface of the ironing board. You make sure there's water in your iron so that you've got steam and that it's on a wool setting, and then just gently, you don't have to press that hard either, just sort of like hover your iron above the fabric a little bit and steam will come out. So you just kind of do that in like one little spot and then move along, do it in the next little spot. So depending on how wide your ironing board is will depend on how many sort of little ironing spots you get on it. in the studio and the shop we have the extra wide ironing boards, so you could probably get maybe between sort of like maybe like 4 or 5 spots on that surface. The ironing board I've got at home's more like a standard narrower one, so then I would say maybe like 3 or 4 ironing spots for that. Once you've done that, you then have to move all of the fabric up to like the next section, so you're kind of making like a little conveyor belt for yourself. Smooth everything out, make sure the interfacing's still lining up with that selvage of your main fabric at the end. Smooth, make sure it's all flat, and then the same again, just doing your spots on the surface of the ironing board and just working your way steadily through the fabric. So it means that there'll be these spots that are fused to the fabric, and then there'll be areas of interfacing where it's just sort of flapping around a little bit and it's not attached at all. So it's once you've then spot fused that interfacing over the whole area of the fabric that you then cut out use your pattern pieces with your that you came with your pattern to cut out the main fabric, and then you'll have those individual pieces of main fabric and interfacing. And some parts of it will be joined and some parts won't, but you have to then go over every single piece and properly fuse the interfacing on, because then you know that it actually needs to be done. You'll have lots of offcuts that are obviously just kind of, you can just sort of leave them. You might be able to save little bits of interfacing for other projects or whatever, but that's the sort of process you have to go through. Then in terms of joining in that second drop of interfacing so that the interfacing covers the whole width of your fabric, you'll have to then just line it up so that the 2 lengths of interfacing just kind of like butt up against each other. If anything, I would probably say having a slight overlap is better than having a gap. I think that would be less obvious in a garment. So just make sure that when you line up your second drop of interfacing onto the fabric that, you know, you're getting them like nice and close together, and that they are definitely going to kind of butt up against each other or very slightly overlap. So that's the process on an ironing board. It would be exactly the same thing if you were doing it on a larger surface, but you would have to just keep moving your ironing blanket or ironing mat around accordingly, so that whenever you put the iron down to do that little spot of interfacing, that the surface that you were working on was actually protected. So I hope that's made it a little bit clearer in terms of sort of what it means and the benefits that it can bring to your garment as well. I do think it's worth it. It might seem like it's taken a little bit longer at the time, but I think overall, when you're investing a lot of time and probably money into making a coat, if there's something that you can do to make that coat just last a lot longer, then I think it's worthwhile doing it, really. If you've got any questions at all, then you can either leave them in the comments here, or if you'd like an answer a little bit quicker, then you can email the girls that work in my shop on info@guthrie-ganny.co.uk, and they'll be able to help and advise you as well. But thanks so much for watching, guys. If you haven't subscribed to my channel already, just remember to hit subscribe so you don't miss out on my next video, and I'll see you next time. Thanks, bye.